The rise of Sefardic Jewry began 1,000 years before Ashkenazic Jewry and began really with the expulsion of the Jews from Israel by the Romans. This is our fourth part of our Jewish history crash course, Jews in the Middle Ages, and our first unit will be the Jews of Sfarad. So the Jews are decimated after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135. Israel is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, and Jews are scattered throughout what became known as the diaspora, the exile, the galut, as we call it in Jewish sources. And Jews spread, as we see, all over the North African coast was a very large population. Also, as far away as Spain, which is already perhaps referenced in some biblical sources, but Jewish communities have been found also in France, in ancient Gaul. There is evidence of Jewish communities. The main Jewish community, however, developed in Rome. And Jews also moved to Greece, to Asia Minor and Turkey, and even to the east of that. Now, the idea of the scattering of our people and of being sent into exile is not a foreign one. We saw the exile from the Babylonian exile, which only lasted 70 years. But in the book of Deuteronomy, it tells us something extraordinary. Deuteronomy 28:63, God will scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you will serve other gods of wood and stone, who neither you nor your ancestors have experienced. Now, the Babylonian exile, the Jews were by and large moved en masse to Babylonia. It's only after the Romans that we were scattered throughout the whole world. Furthermore, if you think about it, the two religions which Jews were subjugated by were Christianity, which is represented by the cross, which is wood, and Islam, represented by the Mecca stone. So there are those who want to see in this verse even a hint, a prophecy of not just us being scattered to all the ends of the earth, South America, Asia, there are Chinese Jews, Australia, you name it, but even the hint of which religions would subjugate us. And there's another prophecy given in the book of Deuteronomy that says, God will send you back to Egypt in galleys by a route which I have told you should not see again. And this is actually documented in the Talmud, where it says there was an incident involving 400 young boys and girls who were taken captive for the purpose of prostitution. And we're told that they were being taken to Alexandria. They sensed what was going to happen, and they said, if we commit suicide and drown in the sea, will we be given eternal life? Now, the history of the diaspora, unfortunately, is going to be a history of terrible persecution, of anti-Semitism. And we're going to have to address this and look at it. And there are going to be situations where Jews were faced with this question, which was that there are certain acts that are so antithetical to our very being that one has to give up one's life rather than commit them. Idolatry, forbidden sexual relations, and murdering another person. The question is, can one proactively take one's life in order to not be put in that position? And the Jews in Masada, a famous holdout of Jewish rebels against Rome, also, according to Josephus, committed mass suicide. This question is very complex for another time and a longer talk about suicide in Judaism and about martyrdom. But what we see here is the incident described in Deuteronomy, unfortunately, in the Talmud, coming to life. And this was to give us just a window into the extent of the suffering and the terrible circumstances which Jews were subjugated to by the Romans. Now, there was one could say, one refuge where Jews did find some sense of security, and that was Babylonia, Babylonian Jewry, which was known as the Sassanian Empire. The Persian Empire was long gone, but its more later version was where the Jews still lived. Remember, Jews were brought to Babylonia in 500 BCE. And when they returned 70 years later to Israel, only a minority returned. So it must have been that there was a very sizable population in Babylonia for more than 500 years. We know very little about that community. And this mosaic is from the famous Dur Europa synagogue, which is really more in Syria, southern Turkey. But we see the depictions of Jewish life, of perhaps the temple on the bottom with the menorah and the other vessels. But we also have a depiction of a synagogue. We have Jews with livestock and what looks like a Roman Catholic priest, but undoubtedly was a Jew who dressed in those in those clothes. So the importance of the Jewish Babylonian community cannot be overstressed, because as we started to talk about last week, the innovation that really saved the Jewish people and kept us alive was the Babylonian Talmud. And there's a story of a group of rabbis who went to visit the Dalai Lama in 1990 on his invitation. And he invited them to come to India, where he and his followers and his people were in exile. And he asked them a pointed question. He wanted them to come to ask them, how do you survive as a people in exile? How do you not lose your beliefs, your sense of peoplehood? What is the Jewish secret for survival out of your land? This story was documented by a Jew who was practicing Buddhist, Raju Kamenetz, who went with them, who wrote a book, The Jew in the Lotus. And it's a very good read. And the answer ultimately is that it was the Torah that ensured our survival. The study of the Torah, the living of the Torah, the value we give to the Torah and its education and its teachings. And that mainstay of the Torah's teachings was really encapsulated in the Talmud. Now, we spoke about the Mishnah, the core of the Talmud, which was written in the year 200, right after, in Israel after the destruction. But it wasn't until another 300-400 years later that the expansion on the Talmud, in the orange here, was written. And the entire Talmud is some 70 volumes, well, 26 volumes that often are in 70 installations. And if you study one page a day, it'll take you 7.5 years to go through the entire Talmud. And there's actually a program called Daf Yomi, a page a day, which I jumped in on about 5.5 years ago, and which is a tour through the entire Talmud. It's quite a massive corpus. And it is the mainstay of the recording of Jewish practices, Jewish life, along with stories, some of them historical, some of them philosophical, some of them ethical, moral. And the Talmud was expanded upon, and we'll talk about the commentaries on the page of the Talmud that expanded them. Now, the Talmud was written around the 5th century, and to the left you have this next period of sages called the Gaonim, from about 500 to 1000 of the Common Era, were also based in Babylonia. So you really had 1,000 years of Jewish community, of Jewish strength, of a flourishing Jewish community, which was, by the way, given, as many were in the Middle Ages, to a certain extent, prerogative to rule and to manage their own affairs. So one could say that during this period, the first 1,000 years, this was the main Jewish community. There were also, as we saw in Deuteropos, a significant community in Turkey, Byzantine, which we don't know a lot about. And it won't be until around the year 1000 that the Sephardic communities start to take more prominence. Now, when we use the term Sfarad, it refers to Spanish Jewry. And so Sephardim, who we kind of all lump together, really are an amalgam of different communities. The Persian Jewish community, the Iraqi community, which are often called Edut HaMizrach, sometimes both of them are. There's the communities of the Maghreb of North Africa, some of whom came from Spain after the expulsion, but many of whom were there before. So you really have different Sephardic identities and communities. But the Spanish Jewish community started to attain its prominence around the turn of the millennium. There was actually a self-ruled Jewish kingdom around the 8th century in Spain that did have an army and did even fight militarily. We don't have a lot of documentation about these earlier communities, but here we see in the cover picture we used for this series, the Sephardic synagogue, marked by the prayer from the center, by the Chazan, by the cantor leading services, the hanging lamps, the elevated bima, which, if you look here on the left, this is from one of these synagogues in Sfat. You see a very similar layout and architecture and the hanging lamps. So if we're going to talk about Sephardic Jewry, we need to talk about Muhammad and the Jews and the beginnings of Islam. Muhammad declared himself as a prophet in the year 613 in Medina, which is today in Saudi Arabia, and he preached to the Jews. And as we can see, he drew, as we know, he drew from the Torah itself, although rewritten, and some of the stories changed. But he advocated circumcision, not eating pork, fasting on holidays, which parallels Yom Kippur, and in the beginning, prayer towards Jerusalem. And he hoped to preach and to be adopted by Jews, his beliefs, as well as by the polytheistic tribes surrounding him. The Jews rejected his teachings, and more for political suspicion of alliances with the other tribes, he attacked and killed the Jews of Banu Qurayza in the first years of his conquests. A few battles later, the Jews in Khaybar were attacked, but their crops were taken, and a precedent was set called the jizya, which was a tax establishing a precedent for Jews being dhimmi, which was an official status, so in a sense protected, but yet at the same time being second-class citizens, often having to wear special clothes. Often if a Muslim was walking on the sidewalk, the Jew would have to go into the street. The synagogue could not be taller than the mosque. And of course, a head tax that was paid. And what we're going to see is that one can say that by and large, Jews had it better under Islam than under Christianity. Now, the bar is not very high for that. When we start talking about Christian anti-Semitism, we're going to see the extent of the suffering under Christianity. But in Islam, there were times where it was calm, maybe even good, and times where it was bad and there were pogroms. If we look at the Quran on the Jews, you find both attitudes. You find in 247, O children of Israel, call to my mind my favor which I bestowed on you, and that I made you excel the nations. So there's positive statements about Jews, but then there's also statements about Jews and Christians, those who disbelieve the people of the book, meaning Muslims, and the polytheists will be in the fire of hell and stay there forever. They are the worst of all beings. So you really have both. You have positive statements about Jews and very negative ones. So when we think of Jews in Spain, we're often recalled the golden age of Spain, which lasted approximately from about the 900s to, one could say, the middle 1100s. We'll see why. One of the figures that marked this period was Shmuel Hanagid, who was the second in command in the city-state of Granada. He ran the economy. He was a brilliant general. He really was like a Joseph figure in Egypt. He ran the entire city-state for the king. And yet, even though his son was supposed to take over after him, when he died, there were pogroms, there were riots, and thousands of Jews were killed. So the golden age of Spain was marked by a certain degree of tolerance, by study of philosophy, of the sciences, math, medicine, in a sense, a Muslim Renaissance, where they drew from Greek texts and Greek wisdom, where there was a flourishing of the arts as well, and Jews played a central role in this society and integrated into very high levels of the society. Some of them remaining traditional, some of them perhaps weakening in their traditions. But even in the golden age of Spain, things weren't always good. In Seville, there were pogroms and Jews killed. In Toledo, Jews were killed as well. So there were periods of quiet and times of persecution. Now, if we think about, and we'll talk about how it ended, when we talk about one of the great figures, perhaps the greatest figure of Sephardic Jewry and of medieval Jewry in general, the great Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, who lived from 1135 to 1204. He was born in Spain, in Cordoba, and one can visit there, and they very much celebrate his origins from there. But when he was a young man, approximately 10 years old, there was a movement within Islam, the Almohads, who came from Egypt, some say from the court of the vizier, perhaps even eunuchs from that court, and they practiced and spread and imposed what we would call today a more fundamentalist reading of Islam, where they shut down the study of philosophy and the arts. They had a much more extreme view of mores and morality and enforced it, and also no tolerance for the minorities. Maimonides and his family had to flee Cordoba. The exact chronology is not clear. It appears they fled around Spain for a certain period of time and eventually made their way to Fez, Morocco, where they lived for some period of time, perhaps as much as 10 years. It was also controlled by the Almohads, and there's actually a big question of, were they able to live as Jews, or is it possible that they even lived openly as Muslims and kept their Jewish practices private? The question of whether one is allowed to do this is very complicated, but an important point needs to be made, which is that Islam is pure monotheism, much more than Christianity. So in some ways, it's closer to Judaism, and in fact, a Jew can pray in a mosque, but not in a church. And so this question, we don't know historically how they survived. But during this period, Maimonides already was able to write his first great commentary on the Mishnah. Now, at the age of 17, 18, he wrote a textbook on logic, which was used for hundreds of years. And we're going to start to see the type of brilliant mind that Maimonides had. And He, over the next 10 years after that, would move to Israel, where he and his father and brothers lived temporarily. Israel had been decimated by the Crusades, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and really was uninhabitable. There was famine, there was great destruction, and he left Israel. Even though in his code he writes categorically one is not allowed to leave the land of Israel if one is there. There are some exceptions, and if one's life would be in danger, one would be allowed to. And he moved to Egypt. Now, I did read in some of the histories that there are letters from the city of Ashkelon, which had a sizable Jewish community, inviting Maimonides there to be the rabbi there. And some people want to suggest he had to move to Egypt to find a wife, some people because of the dangers of Israel. But it does appear that there might have been an option for him to live in Israel. What's so problematic, and we saw in the quote earlier about Egypt, is that the Torah tells us that we're not allowed to go back to Egypt. Once again, we assume that it was in danger of his life, in which case that law of the Torah would be suspended. He moves to Egypt, and for the first 10 years, he is supported by his brother, David, who is a merchant, and he writes his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah, which literally means the teaching of the Torah, the repetition of the Torah, which is the same name used for the book of Deuteronomy. And there's even a statement that's from Moshe to Moses from the Torah, to Moshe ben Maimonides, there has never arisen anyone like Moshe. Now, the Mishneh Torah took the entire Talmud, and the Talmud is really almost a stream of consciousness, where it jumps from one topic to another. There is a general theme, but it'll bring in parallels from totally different topics because it's trying to parallel for an argument's sake. So you will have scattered throughout the Talmud, one topic might be scattered in 5 different places. Maimonides took the entire corpus of the Talmud, reformulated it in 14 volumes, ordered it by theme, and one can't even fathom the mind that could do such a work. Of course, it's not just the mind and the brilliance of our scholars that we value, it's their integrity and who they are and their morals. So Maimonides' brother tragically passed away at sea on a business trip. And he writes in his next great work, which was written at the end of his life, The Guide for the Perplexed. In the introduction, there's a letter. And the letter explains to us why from 40 years old till in his 60s, he hadn't written anything. He needed to go find a livelihood. So he became a doctor. And once again, you see the brilliance that he knew all science. Not only did he become a doctor, but he was recruited by the vizier of Cairo to be the doctor of the royal court. And he became the greatest doctor due to his brilliance. And he describes how he would go in the morning by donkey early at dawn to Fashtat, which was where the city of Cairo is located, and which is now an area of Cairo, next to Cairo. And he would travel by donkey. He would attend to the vizier and his court. Then he would come back home. There would be a line of people out the door waiting to see him. And he would see to them for their medical needs. Then there was a line out his door of people to see to them for their physical needs. And he would then try to attend to his own studies with barely time to do that before he fell asleep over his book to start another day. So his life was really dedicated to the community. And because of his position, he was also able to advocate and find favor for the Jewish community. And the status of the court Jews will be one we will trace throughout the Middle Ages and modernity, of Jews having positions of prominence. And Jews rose to positions of prominence in the Sephardic world, as we mentioned, but it was also a period of great Jewish creativity. Some of the other great names were Yehuda Halevi, who was the great poet, right, celebrated as one of the greatest poets of the Middle Ages in the Jewish world. He was also recognized in high levels of Spanish society. He was born in Christian Spain in the early 1100s, but he moved to Muslim Spain, spent years there going back and forth, and was celebrated as a great poet. And in the end of his life, he will renounce his status and his recognition and his fame and his potential wealth, and he will drop everything and leave to go to the land of Israel. And so his story is very dramatic. And the account of the story is that at the end of his life, he finally arrived to the gates of Jerusalem only to be struck down and killed in front of the gates. And this was recorded some 400 years later in a Jewish history book. And how do we know what actually happened? So, and how do we have other testimonies of life in the Middle Ages for the Jews, such as you see here, the signature of Maimonides, of Moshe bar Rav Maimon. How we actually have Maimonides' original signature on one of his documents, on one of his works. So in the 1890s, there were two women adventurers from England. Orientalism was very popular, and they traveled to Egypt to seek out the Egyptian monuments. And when they were in Cairo, they were Jewish, and they came across some historical relics, documents. And they found them very interesting, so they brought them back to England. And they sought out a Rabbi Solomon Schechter, and showed them to him. And he realized that these are not just Hebrew documents, but they're ancient Hebrew documents. They date from hundreds of years before in the Middle Ages. And he found it so significant that he traveled back to Egypt with them. And he went to the synagogue in Cairo. Now, Jewish holy texts that are written in Hebrew are not allowed to be thrown out because they have sanctity, they have kedusha. So they're usually put away, stored, and often buried with reverence in the ground. Sometimes even when people are buried, they'll be buried alongside, but they're treated with reverence. In Egypt, in this synagogue, they were not put in the ground, but they were put in the attic of the synagogue. And not just holy books, but anything written in Hebrew, which was considered the holy language, was stored in the attic. And so Solomon Schechter uncovered an entire trove of hundreds of years of testimony to Jewish life. And this is known as the Cairo Geniza, meaning the storehouse. He brought many documents back to Cambridge, and over the next 100 years, they would be studied, unfolding for us incredible windows into Jewish medieval life, and particularly Sephardic life. And so that's where we found Maimonides' signature. And that's where we found a letter written 3 months after Yehuda Halevi died. And we found numerous letters about his journey to Israel, where he went through Egypt and stayed there some 7-8 months. And on the margin of the letter, it talks about him arriving in Jerusalem, coming to the gates, and then it talks about the divine presence, some religious experience, and it refers to him as a holy martyr, which would have been evidence that, in fact, he had been struck down. The text is difficult to decipher, but there are historians who do see this as giving a source for the story that we have recounted 400 years later in the Jewish history books. And so it led the Vilna Gaon to say about stories, don't believe all of them, but don't discount them as well. So Jewish Sephardic life saw an incredible flourishing in the Spanish Peninsula, in North Africa. There were great rabbinic figures. In fact, the head of the academy near Cordoba was where Maimonides' father studied. And it was Rabbi Shlomo Alfasi, who was actually from Morocco, and at the end of his life traveled to Spain. So he brought the greatness of his knowledge and of his wisdom from Morocco to Spain. As we journey further into the Middle Ages, we will talk about the eventual expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, but that was way after the Spanish reconquest of Spain. And the golden age of Andalus, of Jewish life in southern Spain, really petered out after the Almohade invasion, after the fleeing of Maimonides, and Jewish Sephardic life shifted to southern France, to North Africa, and we'll see its reemergence in the East as well. And because Jews from Spain will travel to Turkey and to Israel, and will create a revival at that time.